Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Locals, Twitter, Telegram, as well as now there's a new support option as well, not just including Locals, but also Buy Me a Coffee, which is also in the description box below. So now you have two ways to support me directly. And again, I'll just reiterate what Locals offers is if you join me on Locals and you're a supporter, you can interact with the channel directly, making recommendations and comment on what could possibly come next. Also, this is the next episode 26 of the Casual Stream on the history and Simulacra. So we have Minoan and Zero World. Hello, everyone. So I will begin by reading from 1984. He who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. Whatever was now true was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory, reality control, they called it, newspeak, doublethink. So this right here is where we're going to start with our framing for the history and the simulacra. So what is the simulacra? How does it relate to history? It can relate to history in at least four ways. One is it changes nouns, persons, places, things, debunking. Two, it reinforces narratives. Three, it generates nostalgia for the past. And four, it creates its own hyperreality. So let's start with the first one. Changes nouns, persons, places, and things. So there's a little bit of a context. When I was in college, the debunking and deconstruction of the past was in full swing. The past was brutish, nasty, and short. Everybody was bigoted and narrow-minded. We were open-minded moderns and enlightened. Everything was racist, sexist, imperialist, homophobic, anti-science, etc., etc., etc. The system had to deconstruct the past since certain beliefs still existed that drew inspiration from the past that needed to be removed for the next simulation to be uploaded. I would argue that what was Baudrillard's third stage of the simulation, so that period in history in the aughts, 2006, 2010, when I was in college, I would argue this is the third stage of the simulation of Baudrillard, where it's trying to hide what's there, which I guess would be the truth. And so what happens then is when the simulation does, quote, history in this sense, it fetishizes the exceptions, which in turn makes them norms. So, for example, the Sparta had unique norms, right? There was a kind of what makes Sparta unique is in part it's, not having private property and also being highly militaristic. Although the simulation loves to focus on various bizarre sexual fetishes of other countries. Like I remember there was when they were rolling out the LGBTQ stuff in the 2000s, they were focusing on practices of like Thai prostitutes. I know that's where we were at back in the 2000s. And what they don't understand, what they most fail to understand, I think some do and they just don't care, is if we view practices and beliefs as a sort of a molecular components of a civil society and a culture, if you have those that go along the grain of nature and human nature, then you can support a few eccentric habits and behaviors. Whereas if you replace all of these molecular components with eccentric habits and behaviors, well, then guess what? Your civilization falls apart. And that's what we're seeing right now. The other thing is they have to paint this house of horrors picture of history so that nobody wants to leave the simulation. If you're healthy and fit and you don't need all these antibiotics and drugs and you can get around on a bike and don't have to, get cooped up in a car or a train, then you don't need the simulation and you can find more satisfying real experiences in the world with other people that the simulation doesn't want you to have. So that's created this impression that life was brutish, nasty, and short. Now, how does it do that? Well, there's a few ways, right? One is people disappear. So they're H.H. Mulliner of the Coventry Ordinance, who was a key conspirator in the 1909 Dreadnought Scare, which directly led England into World War I with Germany by provoking a naval arms race, along with Jack Fisher from the Royal Navy, who was then Secretary of the Navy, and Lord Balfour and this triumvirate in order to generate revenue funding. So revenue for the Coventry Ordnance Works, bigger budget for the Navy. And I think Balfour was more on the jingoist side of the political spectrum in England. So it worked for all of them. So in Robert K. Massey's Dreadnought from 1991, the quote official, which I guess is official for the Royal Navy history, he leaves out Mulliner completely, which means he's just clearly a hack. Winston Churchill at the time was a Liberal MP who opposed Mulliner and others for scaremongering a war with Germany. We also have Francis Nielsen's The Diplomats Make War. That's another work that goes into this. We also have Bertrand Russell and J.F.C. Fuller talk about this. So it's not like H.H. Mulliner is this nobody. Very well-known, well-respected diplomats, statesmen, generals, and politicians knew about this guy. Well, why don't we know about him now? Because we're not meant to know about him. It gets in the way. The other thing is, if they don't disappear, they become the opposite of who. So this is kind of an extension of the Stalinism, where Stalin airbrushes Trotsky out of the revolutionary pictures. He airbrushes executed secret police executives out of the pictures. This is a Stalin-esque, basically. And then we have people are turned into the opposite of who they really were, right? So we have three groups here: the Acton Institute, the Patrick Henry College, and the Hoover Institute. All of which you think, well, with those namesakes, they must be faithfully representing the opinions of their namesakes. Which, because they take on that name, you assume that, that must be what that guy believed. Well, the Acton Institute was pro-Civil War Lincoln, whereas Lord Acton famously wrote to Robert E. Lee that, and I'm paraphrasing, he mourned the death of liberty at Gettysburg more than he praised the victory of it at Waterloo. You're not going to hear that from the Acton Institute. Patrick Henry College doesn't, Patrick Henry himself was a critic of the Constitution. He thought that the Constitution had many flaws. The Bill of Rights was a compromise. And so, yet, they don't take an anti-federalist. Patrick Henry was the leading anti-federalist author. And yet, they take a very pro-federalist constitutional view. Kind of insane. Kind of exactly the opposite of Patrick Henry, right? Herbert Hoover, in his book Freedom Betrayed, was opposed to World War II. He ran in 1940 in order to prevent Roosevelt from instigating the conflict. The Hoover Institute, views World War II as a sacred holy war. Again, these men are completely if you got pictures of these men from the institutions that bear their name, you get a picture completely opposite from reality. Another good one is Bertrand Russell, right? Bertrand Russell in the heyday of the New Atheists and 2000, 2010, as well as the heyday of science literacy, nonsense crap. Bertrand Russell was trotted out as this prophetic hero of science. And yet, if you look at his actual views of a scientific society, he's actually he becomes quite critical and despairing of the fate of humanity. In his 1931 work, The Scientific Outlook, and his 1953 work, The Impact of Science on Society, he predicts the state that we're in now. He says that the control over the press and people's lives by a totalitarian regime, like, for example, the Soviet Union is the one he mentions in The Impact of Science on Society, because that's in the 50s, would be as great or greater under a democracy, under a highly developed technical society. This is written before Ellul's On Technique, and he's coming to pretty much the same conclusion. So again, what we see about Russell is completely the opposite of what he actually said and wrote. So that's another way in which you can make this stuff go away or disappear. And so I chose persons, but you could also, this process could also take place for places and things. So that's the first thing you do. That's the first way it relates to history. So again, I'll reiterate this first relationship to history. It debunks it. It portrays this house of horrors of brutish, nasty, and short, and bigoted and everything, so that you don't want to leave the simulation. It's nice and warm and safe, and history is scary. So going back in time, metaphorically, by going into the future with new ideas, say, for example, Kunstler's Long Emergency, well, that's scary, that's bad, we can't do that. And then it also creates it creates a impression of history that points to the next stage of the simulation, the next stage that they want you to go to. And so they do that by either deleting people, by flipping them into their absolute opposites. And they can do this for places and things as well. And so anybody that's well informed and to the lies within the history, and then mentally and physically healthy enough to live without the simulation and the machine, wouldn't get there. They don't want that person because that person can then just walk away. And this is closely related to what I just said, is two reinforcing narratives. So the simulation, let's look at the US example, has a certain telling of a history of its own, from the Constitutional Convention to the Civil War to World War I to World War II. Each of these historical narratives have, quote, the losers, the unpopular people. I mean, we could even go to the American Revolution. So in the Revolution, it's the Tories. In the Constitutional Convention, it's the Anti-Federalists. In the Civil War, in this sense, I mean domestic losers, that'd be the Copperheads, the Unionists who opposed invading the South. World War I, that would be isolationists. At that time, many of them were socialist. And then World War II, again, isolationists. At this point, it's different. Most of them were actually right-wing conservative type people, like his name escapes me right now, but the guy that flew across the Atlantic for the first time, he was in favor of isolationism. All of these people, either one, they're vilified, that's going back to stage one, or two, they disappear so that you don't even know there was opposition. And so you only get one narrative, that of the people that won. So we don't hear about the Tories, we hear about the Patriots. We don't hear about the Anti-Federalists, we hear about the Federalists. We don't hear about the Copperheads, we hear about Lincoln. We don't hear about the anti-war socialists in World War I. We hear about the interventionists. We don't hear about the right-wing anti-war advocates in World War II. We don't hear about FDR. And so what this does is, again, it does two things. It reinforces the links in the chain of the simulation that have already been laid down. And it also it facilitates the first goal of preparing the way to the next level of the simulation. And so rather than looking at those, quote, the quote, losers of these political struggles and actually reading what they said, actually giving them a fair shake, actually seeing if they had something interesting to say. So, for example, I'll give you two examples. One is the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists argued in 1787, 88, and 89 that the United States Supreme Court, as it was constructed within the Constitution, would be one of the most tyrannical forces in history. What do you know? It's exactly what it's become. Able to circumvent, the Constitution directly. In fact, one anti-federalist very presciently said the Constitution imbues the Supreme Court with the ability to be the final court of appeals in interpreting the Constitution, which in fact means the Supreme Court has no limiting powers at all, because the Supreme Court, in interpreting the Constitution, interprets the scope of its own powers. 1787. That's very useful to know, but we're not allowed to know that. Two is the Copperheads. Why were the Copperheads Copperheads? They were afraid that if Abraham Lincoln normalized conscription, which at the time was a relatively new innovation in the U.S. experience, that would lead to tyranny at home and imperialism abroad, something that Lee said after the war. Well, they weren't wrong either. See, we're not allowed to know that these people existed because they were often right. And so either they have to be defamed. I do remember hearing about Copperheads back in the day, but you're probably not going to hear about them much now. And then, so we need to support the simulations narrative. The best way to do this is to have people not read books. This gets back to Huxley. Aldous Huxley said in Brave New World, he believed that the more terrifying reality was not the one where the government or the regime destroys books, but creates the regime in which they create a society in which nobody wants to read books. That's where we're at now. Nobody wants to read books. And it's interesting that Huxley had inside knowledge. His brother Julian worked for UNESCO, which was a UN organ. So he sort of had inside knowledge, so to speak. And so then the goal is to shift our consumption of this knowledge and information from books or when it was still relevant, oral sources, much of which are irrelevant now because they're dead, but there was a time when they were alive and the simulation was still operating, to films, comic books, TV shows, and the news. Which I mentioned this once before in a tweet on Twitter. Imagine if we had access to no books before 1945 and only products of the simulation to tell us about it. Would we ever be able to know about the past? No. We would be in an inescapable prison. And the only way out is to read books from the past. But of course, that's then the question. We do have the books. They haven't been destroyed. We're not living in 1984 future. We're living in a Brave New World future. All right. The next thing is nostalgia for the past. So in a previous video on the simulation, I mentioned how people are being rendered obsolete. They as the simulation advances, not everybody's able to keep up. What is one of the ways you deal with them? Well, one of the things is you get them invested in the past. There's this weird past future fetish with the simulation, right? Because on the one hand, the simulation is always pointing to this event horizon of a perfect utopian future that's right around the corner. And that's what's driving everybody to that future point. But then there's people that are either too old or just not paying attention to the simulation, or for whatever reason, they're not really on the right page. But you still either need them because they have technical skills, or B, you don't know what to do with them yet. So you get that to control them, and this goes back to the machinist hermaphrodite, this sort of idea of like controlling them, pacifying them. You do it by generating nostalgia but it has to be, it's usually nostalgia for a period of time that they lived through. So for the boomers, it's the 60s and 70s. For the Gen X, it's the 80s and 90s. For the millennials, it's the early 2000s. And so what they'll do is they'll then create this unreal version, this hyper real version of the past that you lived through. And so it's like, well, I lived through that. Those were the good old days. Let's just stay in the good old days. And then so you just get stuck in these, TV shows, movies, I guess now, VR interactive worlds where you just relive that time period. And what that does is it gets people directed inward and more dependent on the machine, even if they're not fully updated with all the patches, so to speak. And now we get to the fourth and final element here: history as hyperreality. So again, to restate it again from Baudrillard, hyperreality is that which points only to itself. And the fourth level simulation, Simulacra, does not point to anything at all, right? It makes no reference to any reality whatsoever. So one of the things that I noticed, I don't know, about 15 years ago or more, is whether it was, in fantasy as a genre, which included games, it was also movies and TV shows, as well as, various games. I noticed this trend where the designers or the creators of this content would put more and more women in, quote, combat roles, because especially for RPGs, because you want to customize all your characters. And I'm like, this is just patently absurd, right? Antiquity, Middle Ages, early modern period, even in World War II with like the desperate Russians, conscripting women. There we don't see women in combat for obvious reasons: secondary sex characteristics, problem of pregnancies, problem of menstruation, all sorts of problems that don't really need to get into. But we're just supposed to believe that's not real, and that this is just normal. So what they start off doing is they go back to the first iteration of this process, debunking history. So they find exceptions. So for the whole, let's go to the woman warrior archetype. We have Joan of Arc, we have Mulan, we have ambiguous references to Amazons in ancient Greek history, etc. So some of these characters were real, but extremely rare. And one of the reasons why the historians bothered to write about these women, was because they were so unusual, so rare. And they'll be like, oh, well, that could just be normalized. Well, no, it can't. But you see, the simulation has to start with something real and then exaggerate it to absurd, grotesque proportions. And now you get, Game of Thrones, where every other knight is a woman. And it's like, it's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. So what it is it is a reflection in history. Then becomes a mirror which reflects the world we live in, because there never was any other world but the world we live in. Okay, and so something like Game of Thrones is a perfect example of this, or any number of trash from HBO's Rome, HBO's Deadwood. I mean, apparently the ancient Romans and the Wild West were just as violent and oversexed as we are today, even though that's physically impossible. Because, for example, the material conditions were different, right? If what we are experiencing as of the 2022 or 2005 when HBO's Rome came out, the material conditions of 2005 were not the material conditions of first century BC Rome. So ipso facto, the behavior of individuals in modern America as of 2005 could not have been the behavior of Romans. But that's what they're going to do. They're going to just superimpose it on. They're just wearing a different costume. So what that does is it creates this hyperreality of history. And what that does is it as long as you don't read books and read anything real, it effectively cuts you off from the past. You're completely cut off from the past, and you're ultimately deracinated in the most fundamental way. Cicero once said, if you're ignorant of history, you remain a child forever. So people have written about the neoteny of modern man in the West. Well, one aspect of neoteny is not knowing the past. And this profound deracination from the past by creating this history as hyperreality history is one of the key efficient causes by which this takes place. And so the sort of historical struggle here is one of the key components of how they control us. And again, this hyperreality of history, at its most fundamental level, it's absurd intuitively, right? Because if we look at any given set of social morality, sexual behavior, levels of, drug use or whatever in the modern age is based off of a certain level of technological development and the simulation's development. That cannot be the case ipso facto in the past, because the past did not have those material conditions. They don't want you asking those questions. They want you to just, through the spectacle of the hyper reality of the movie and the TV portrayal of, I mean, again, I think Oliver Stone is a good director, but it's ridiculous that his Alexander has all of this, bisexuality in it. Like, this is not it's not there. You read these accounts about Alexander. I just finished The Life of Alexander by Plutarch. And Plutarch said that Alexander, far from being hedonistic, was well known for his circumspection in regard to that issue of life. And there's no hint. And in fact, Alexander the Great was the opposite of a pederast. According to Plutarch, after the Battle of Issus, some Greeks from the West said, in honor of your victory, we've got some boys for you. And Alexander said, what made you think I was even interested in such a thing? So we have an ancient account which contradicts the idea that Alexander was bisexual, but it doesn't matter, because we're creating hyperreality of antiquity. So who cares if Alexander is, committing bestiality? It doesn't matter to us. It's just part of the game. So what does all this mean? Well, what it means is there was this Marxist website that was called History as a Weapon, and it had what was it called? The People's History of America. Yeah, that book that was popular in the late 90s, early 2000s by Howard Zinn. That's a good example of this, right? Because Howard Zinn was notorious for just making stuff up, fudging things, and creating this very contrived presentation to make a point. Now, obviously, Harold Zinn's vision did not win out. That's not really why I picked Zinn, but I picked Zinn because he represents a methodology of history as simulacra. Now, he's on the left, he's trying to create a counter narrative to the one that he sees being created by capitalist America. He failed because capitalist America was able to sort of absorb his criticism. He said, oh, all these minorities and women are getting mistreated, and we need to have socialism. And then the corporate America is like, no, we don't need socialism. We'll liberate all these people for you. And so he kind of stole Zinn's thunder. But ultimately, what this does is it creates, again, what many on the DR are concerned about. And then you could say also the Marxists with, deracination for the DR and alienation for the Marxists. Part of what makes us connected to anything, whether it's people or places, is our understanding of those people and places. Right? What do we say about ourselves? What do we say about where we live? What do we say about how we got to this point in our lives, in the lives of our civilization, the lives of our culture? Everything. That's why 1984 talks about controlling the past. And so then, going back to Orwell's statement, right? How does this work? So if you control the past, you control the future, and the present controls the past. So let's unpack Orwell for the simulation. The current simulation. So the people in charge today, the Black Rocks and vanguards of the world, they control everything. What we might call the haute bourgeoisie. They then control the present, which allows them to rewrite the past, which allows them to control the future. And so what's sort of interesting here is 1984 is a critique of a kind of Soviet-style communism, which at the time seemed to be the bigger threat from Orwell's point of view as a libertarian socialist. But what we see here is that Orwell's dictum can go both ways. In a quote-unquote technological capitalist society, as was feared by Bertrand Russell, we could see similar levels of totalitarian control, and that's exactly what we've seen. And all of this really is, when you think about it, it's actually quite terrifying that we can be so pulled away from anything that's real. And so then, okay, well then what does that mean? What do we do, right? So the first thing that it means is, it's funny, I'm going to go to Noam Chomsky here, because Noam Chomsky had his documentary Manufacturing Consent. And he talked about how ads and the media do all these things. And he doesn't really mention this issue because he's being an ideologue, he's more narrowly focused. He's not bringing up Baudrillard, he's not bringing up all these other people. But he is right that a lot of these programming, these programs are being put in us without our consent even. And so you just, as much as possible, have to get away from that stuff, because that stuff is just there to prepare us for the next level of the simulation. And this is a theme that I've mentioned in other streams before. The question is, whatever you choose to identify as, you identify as, ethno-nationalist, a neo-pagan, like a Viking or Tradcat or Orthodox or whatever, any of these groups, you actually need to look at the history of what you're talking about. Anybody who's watching my Moldbug streams knows that, getting history wrong is what really triggers me. And a lot of people get history wrong, especially the history of, not just the history of their opponents, but the history of their own side. So they'll say just patently absurd nonsense, things that we have to get away from mediated, simulated views of history. Now, you could say that reading a book is mediated. Yes, it is, but it's not simulated, not necessarily, because a good historian will look at various principles and best practices and actual other texts, which a movie or a TV show or a video game doesn't have to do. It's not even expected to do. Then it's going to be more likely to be real. We could make a brief overview of the relevant hierarchy of sources as a primary source, which is considered the source that was written at the time of the event. So a classic example of a primary source is Caesar's wars, which Caesar himself wrote about his own wars. Many people think, well, people are somewhat skeptical because Caesar, of course, is going to put himself in the best possible light. That's what many critics would say. But nonetheless, that's a primary source. Now it doesn't necessarily have to be the source at that time. It could be the earliest source that we have. So, for example, the Gildas in his history of the Saxon invasion of Britain, is writing somewhat time after the fact. But he's the earliest source that we have, so that's still considered as a primary source. Then we have secondary sources, which are sources that are themselves not primary, but are engaging with other primary sources. So you could say that maybe a good example of a secondary source would be Plutarch. Plutarch is not a primary source, but he's writing about these other Greek and Roman heroes. And in so doing, he's synthesizing it all together. And then there's the tertiary source, which is just so far removed. It'd be like a modern day textbook on ancient Greece. If it's good, it's going to reference these other sources, but it's definitely not on the same level as those sources. The danger with tertiary sources, too, is not just that with an autobiography or a secondary source, you have the bias of the author. You often have these ideological biases that sneak in because these tertiary sources are often representations of a ideological. Another good example of a tertiary source and a bad one at that is The People's History of America, again by Howard Zinn. So that's that. So once you learn how to identify these levels, you want to start reading. If you haven't read any history at all, you probably just want to read what I would consider quality tertiary sources before the academy became this deconstructionist, mess. And those would be books on the history of antiquity in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, written anytime before 1960, maybe even 1970 if you're lucky. I mean, yeah, you're going to have to worry about biases of the author. You're going to have to worry about certain ideological biases. But a lot of these historians are still rooted and wedded to the idea of history as a profession of telling the truth, like Polybius, in a way where you just don't. Well, when you get tied up in nationalistic narratives like in the United States, I guess you do just frankly make stuff up. And if we want to look at the simulation, we could say it maybe starts as early as 1800 with the Industrial Revolution. But again, by and large, you're still going to get a much better sweep of history. If you get advanced enough to read primary sources and understand them, that's better still. But that's the only way out of this particular trap. As the simulacra relates to history, you have to understand what is real history. You have to understand what are the layers of historical texts, and then identify the ones that are reliable. And then the second of all, or rather, the primary source, the secondary source, and the tertiary source. But you also have to pay attention to the fact of who are the really reliable people, and that's just going to come from experience. And the experience is, well, okay, I've read other sources, and what this guy said doesn't show up in any of them, so maybe he's sus. And that's just going to take a lot of effort, and that becomes very specialized. And then the problem becomes, well, how many of us have that time to do all that? Some do. I do, for example, but many don't. So then what do you do? Well, that's where people like me come in, because we can then do all that reading and chewing and digesting for you, and then give you a product, give you something to think about. And of course, sort of tie this all in. That takes a lot of time and effort too. So of course, supporting people like us, like me, is a great idea, great way to keep this content going so that we can get out of the simulation, so that we can have a mental framework of history, which basically tells us, where we came from, who we are, where we're going, that is outside of that simulation. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I guess what I'll end with is a brief sort of autobiographical account. So by the time I got to college, when I was in college, I was 19 in 2006. And by that point, I had a working knowledge, more or less, of history from, ancient Egypt until the 9/11, the War on Terror. And I noticed, again, certain patterns that occurred throughout all of history, regardless of whether you were Christian or pagan or Jewish, whether you were, European, Asian, or Native American or Arab. And I was like, okay, well, none of this is working now. None of this seems to be true now. And people were saying things that were just patently absurd, about the roles of certain groups of people in society, certain kinds of practices, usually sexual, that could be normalized. Which I knew from reading all these accounts just could never be. It could never be. And I'm just like, what is this? And I gradually realized that there was essentially, I didn't have names for them yet, but they were basically two broad categories. There was what I would consider the true facts, true accounts of the past. So I would include, just broadly the historical sources that I'd read. And then there were these quote new facts that were given to me by my professors and by other quote unquote educated people. And I had no idea where they were coming from or what their purpose was. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute. How much of this stuff did I imbibe from TV shows, video games, and movies? And so I started this process of rooting out, like okay, which can be justified from what I know from the history that I've read, and what is just completely made up. That then led into a whole bunch of different ways. One was looking at almost, within the North American context, almost all the radical philosophies and political positions from right to left. And doing so, I was able to figure out, well, okay, this is coming from a libertarian source. This is coming from a liberal source. This is coming from a socialist source. And then, okay, well, is that justified by the facts of history? If so, well, is there a better way to account for it? If not, throw it out. And that takes a long time. But what that does, though, and then, of course, as I've read Ellul and Baudrillard, I realized, oh, okay, this is all downstream of this very complex abstract process of simulacra and machines. So we will just wrap this up with a restatement of the four things that it does. Okay, so history is history is simulacra. One, it relates to changes nouns, persons, places, things, debunking. So the past is British, nasty, and short, full of nasty, bigoted people. You don't want to leave the safe, warm simulation. People get deleted because either for whatever reason, for various reasons, they just get deleted and you're not meant to know about them. Or the people that you do know about are portrayed in ways that are 180 degrees opposite of the way they actually were. Two, reinforcing narratives. So first of all, the narrative of the simulation. So pro-technology, Luddites be bad. And then pro whatever nation you're in, which is then hitched its wagon to the simulation. And you reinforcing both of those narratives. You're not supposed to hear about the people that lost the debates of these political military struggles. And you're especially not supposed to hear them if they predicted something that turned out to be true. And in this stage, they want you to get all your information from, TV shows, comic books, movies, blah, blah, blah. Nostalgia for the past. You're an obsolete simulation. We don't know what to do with you yet. They're probably going to end up killing you. But until then, get plugged into some period past of your life that will idolize and sort of tweak for you, customize it for you so that you're super happy and won't want to leave. And that's leading to VR. And then history is hyperreality, where history becomes a mirror that reflects back to us who we are in the 21st century. Which, if you get to that stage, is an inescapable prison, and the only way out is to read books. So on that warm and friendly note, let's see what we got in the chat. Scratchy McDumplewaffles, snowing out here in Oklahoma. Interesting. Youth in Asia, hello. Minoan, Todd, what do you think of the current trend to listen to books rather than to read? I personally listen to books a lot, so I'm not opposed to it in principle. I mean, obviously, there is the problem of if you don't read books, you don't develop certain mental discipline, you don't develop certain thinking patterns. So you still need to do that. But obviously, there are certain things you do during the day, like, say, driving a car to work or doing some menial task around the house, in which it would be impractical to read a book, but not impractical to listen to a lecture or listen to a book. So as long as you don't do that in complete lieu of reading books, because you still have to read books, I think it's a useful supplement. Euthanasia. I never enjoyed reading until I did it on my own. I'm not a fan of most fiction, and school was filled with things I didn't find interesting at all. Well, that's another thing school does. It makes you bored out of your mind. Zero World. Audiobooks have been great. I have to drive a lot. Yep. Zero World. I'd rather sit and read them, though. Picard syndrome. That's a good disease to have. It's a good disease to have. Let's see. Yeah, Manoa and Zero World I like listening to, but there's a limiting factor. It's not really possible to pause. I mean, I guess it depends on what you're using. I, for example, use Audible, and you can pause audiobooks. And rereading passages or go back. Well, yeah, you can't reread and going back. Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Zero World. Can we get a stream where Prazophile reads the Bible in its entirety, start to finish, a kind of speed run of the Bible? Wow, I don't know. Minoan, there should be an Iron Man competition for people reading Leviticus. Lol. Let's see. A Deo Rex. Hey Todd, could you give us some tips on reading Aristotle's Metaphysics and Thomas Aquinas? Well, I haven't read Aristotle's Metaphysics. I've read his Politics and Nicomachean Ethics. And I will be working on a reading list for philosophy soon. Herodotus and Thucydides are excellent reads. I have not read Thucydides, but I know he's a must read, and I have read Herodotus at least once. Lady Mercia. I collect all sorts of antique books on art, philosophy, etc. I feel like preserving these beautiful books is so important as we get more and more sucked into the digital revisionist world. Well, that'll be even more important once we enter the long emergency and all the stuff we have on digital technology goes bye-bye. So yeah, it's a very important thing to do there. Cyberpunk Internal Affairs. I've got a 2-volume H.G. Wells, The Outline of History from 1920. Hope it's good. I have, I think, volume 2 of that set. I read it as a kid, parts of it as a kid. I think it's good enough. I mean, obviously, Wells is going to have a certain modern humanist gloss to all of it. But from what I remember, he's not the kind of guy to just completely fabricate things. Minoan, Cyberpunk International Affairs at Minoan until Todd tells me it's not. Minoan, what if Todd doesn't know? Well, I have the second volume and I've read parts of it. I think it was good enough. I'd have to look at it again to say for sure. Cyberpunk International Affairs. I've got those sitting on my bookshelf right now. Haven't read it yet. Wells was a socialist, but I'm trying to go in with an open mind. I mean, if you have it, you should probably read it because it's going to be at least interesting as an expression of that individual's thinking at that time. And Wells represents a tremendous stream of thought already, so that's interesting. Oh, where were we here? Back to the chats. Minoan, Oro's post made a tweet about women depression and breaking through the simulation, and women dogpiled him in anger. Well, that reminds me of two things, Minoan. One, Plato's cave. You try to leave the cave and go back in to warn people, Plato says they'll kill you. And I think in large part, Brave New World is a kind of modern retelling of Plato's cave, because when Smith the Savage tries to leave the society and throws the Soma on the ground, they try to kill him. And then, of course, Mustafa Mon sends the police to arrest Smith the Savage and his conspirators and gives them a decision. CVA, Praise of Folly, please recommend some history books to read. Thanks. Okay, I have another reading list then. I'll have to do a history as well as philosophy reading list. Will do, guys. Let's see. Euthanasia. I do enjoy Apostolic Majesties too. He contextualizes a lot of things happening in history all in tandem. Yeah, I've only had one interaction with him on the Morgoth stream, though it was a fairly civil and interesting interaction. See, Speedrunner just showed up. Let's see. Yay. Well, guys, unless you have anything more to say, I might just have to tune out now. Let's see. Only reading list streams from now on. Well, okay, you know what I can do? Somebody said history books. There's a few right off the top of my head. I mean, obviously, is like quote unquote primary sources, if you will. Herodotus is great. He covers the primarily the Persian Greek Wars. We also have Thucydides, who of course covers the Peloponnesian War. Xenophon writes 2 books, the Hellenica, which covers the history of Greece from the end of the Peloponnesian War up until, I think, the fall of Sparta to Epaminondas. And then the Anabasis, the Greek expeditionary force that fought with Cyrus the Younger, who was a usurper from Asia Minor. Those are all must-reads for ancient Greek history. Plutarch is great, and then he gives you a sort of like it's a kind of biographical history where instead of like the normal historical progression you'd find like in Herodotus or Thucydides, he's giving you a description of the character of the people involved, and that's a very interesting take on the history we get. Obviously, Caesar wrote a lot of autobiographical works. He refers to himself in the third person. And I think he's also writing this in a professional style as a military manual for other people to follow. See, that's why I'm kind of suspicious when people say, "Oh, Caesar wrote it. He must be like trying to like blow smoke up his own toga." It's like he's writing a military manual for other people to follow. You know, there's only so much self-flattery you can do that it makes it useless. And the fact that it was considered useful as a military manual for years, millennia afterwards, indicates that Caesar was communicating factual information, not just self-flattery. Let's see. Todd could go boomer and just tell us to figure it out on our own, lol. Then get mad when we can't. Well, don't worry, Zero World. I'm not gonna go boomer on you. Let's see. Euthanasia. Semyogog and Antiochus looked at secret societies. It's pretty interesting for historical references too. And Plutarch is great. Yes, he is. Zero World. That sounds much more like a Gen X than a boomer. I'd say it's probably both. What do you think of Will Durant as a historian? A. Deo Rex. Well, I don't like Will Durant because he writes these. His histories of the Russian Revolution are basically hagiographies of Lenin, ignoring all of Lenin's massacres and atrocities. I think that's because he had socialist tendencies. That's not to say that everything Will Durant wrote about the Russian Revolution was false. It's more that he just chooses to leave certain things out that would make you think differently about Lenin. So, well, everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is the end of History and Simulacra of Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.